Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I'm Joel Erickson. I'm joined as always by Nate Atkins. It is the end of wrap-up week, State of the Colts week. I like State of the Colts. Chris Ballard, State of the Colts address. Yeah. There's some stuff from earlier in the week that we might get into. I know I talked a little bit on the last pod about maybe doing 2 pods this week. It didn't really end up fitting that way. I can't remember what I said we were going to do. It didn't end up really working out that way. So we're just going to do it in here at the end of Ballard. Chris Ballard talked this morning, after what sounded like some digestive issues or something, or forced him to postpone it earlier in the week. You and I were just talking about this before we started the podcast, but there's a way you can look at this. You can look at this press conference where you're like, oh, he said all this stuff before. We've heard all this before, him falling on the sword. But you and I kind of feel like this is a little bit different. Yes, we have heard the falling on the sword stuff before, but there's some stuff about it that was different.
Yeah, I feel like the past pressers I've had with Ballard, this would be the 4th year-end presser now. The past one, he always falls on the sword. It's usually about a specific plan that they implemented that season, a specific move, maybe a non-move. It's something very like, I should have done this tangible move or not done this. We messed up with this. Today's falling on the sword felt more like a bigger picture reflection on all the processes that go into this and stuff that he has. Even though he's fallen on the sword of individual moves in the past, he's mostly doubled down on certain standards and principles and ways of life. I mean, the last time we got him in a presser, granted it was right before the season, but that's when he had a kind of well-known clip where he said that, you either believe in something or you don't, and this is what we believe in, and if it gets me fired, so be it. So the fact that he went through a season with that approach to team building, it didn't get them to the playoffs, but he wasn't fired. I wondered what that message was going to be. I mean, you just come out. I mean, that would almost, in some ways, that could empower that approach of, hey, it didn't, it isn't an ultimatum to have to change clearly, or we wouldn't be in this spot. So what was going to instigate maybe the idea to? And so I just thought when he got into free agency was a different way than he's talked about it before. And mainly the thing that was so different, that was the talk about the culture and some of the problems with that they're having within the building with certain players, big time leaders, just overall where they're at, because that's usually his biggest talking point in absence of the winning is processes we use, the culture we have, how this is eventually going to build something. I thought he read the room well, knowing, I mean, part of it is that time is different than it was 3 or 4 years ago, that we have more evidence of this not panning out so far. But he also seemed to have, when he talked about taking a hard look in the mirror, this was more about the processes he used and the overall philosophy than just, I should have signed DBs or something very specific to this year's team that may not apply or may not change. Doesn't mean it's going to change. There seemed to be, but he even said that words will not ultimately matter, actions will. And that's something I hadn't heard him say before either. So this seemed like the best job I've seen him do so far of reading the room of not only where people are at with his tenure, but kind of what the message should be to try to move this forward, not only with fans, but with a locker room that has had a couple players come out and make comments about preparation or egos in the building, complacency, the things that go back to everything he's proud of to build here is the culture based on contracts and the guys he brings in and all that. And I think that's probably what instigated the different tone, is that it's no longer just, people like us on a podcast talking about it, fans tweeting about it, fans mad about it. He's always answered to that. It's now some of his captains and best players are laying a little bit of credence to this. So I felt like he almost, I think that I have to feel like the comments from DeForest Buckner specifically, who he's, that may be his favorite player ever, or one of them. I have a feeling that forced an even harder look in the mirror at himself and the processes that he has previously said that he wasn't going to change. We got a different message than that today.
Yeah. There's a piece of it where, and he kind of acknowledged this, you already referenced this, where it didn't really matter what he said for most of the fan base. I think it's hard to make a case for him staying. If I was trying to write a column or something on it, it would be difficult to come up with a case. But there's also the reality of the situation, because we asked him several times, what, like, some version of why, like, are you surprised to be back, essentially? But like, there's an element of that. Like, I'm not saying the question doesn't need to be asked. The question does need to be asked, but there's also an element of that that's like, he's back. Like Jim Irsay said, Chris Ballard is back. Jim Irsay, I know this isn't necessarily what people want to hear sometimes, but Jim Irsay is the only one who matters in that evaluation. He's the owner of the team. There's no way around it, really. There's no way around it other than to just say, yeah, like, he's the only one that matters. He decided to bring Ballard back. And so Ballard can't operate in a I should not be here world. Like, the idea of him resigning or something is, I mean, I think we all know that that's pretty far-fetched. So, like I said, those questions are valid, and the questions about why he's back and why Jim Irsay still feels like this is a good idea, like, all of those questions are good, and I would like to hear from Irsay on them specifically. But from a Chris Ballard perspective, it's like he's back. It sounds like he understands, and this is another thing, like, he knows, like, when it's bad. I think we've talked about this a little bit before in the pod, and sometimes he gets stuck with us in the press box, and like, I would say that it's like, it's easy sometimes to think, like, if someone's not doing something that you think with your team that, like, they don't care or it's not a priority or whatever. Like, this dude lives and dies with, like, every snap in games. And that doesn't make him a good general manager at all. Like, it doesn't make any of the mistakes he's made. It doesn't paper over any of the mistakes he's made. But, like, he does care. Like, sometimes very loudly is the way I'll put that. In places where he shouldn't be loud. If you've ever been around him, I know there's some fans who've been around him, like, there's seats that are close to his box or whatever during a game. Like, you see that part of it. So, like, he knows it's been bad. The disconnect, though, is something he admitted, and maybe we just start right here with, he acknowledged that he has not done enough to bring in outside competition. That, like, if you go back and, like, listen to the press conference, or in our case, since we have the transcript, read through the press conference over and over again, he said that like 6 or 7 times. He really did mention not bringing in outside free agents, and specifically the complacency that DeForest Buckner talked about as something that he failed at, especially the last 4 years.
That's where I think he changed the approach from Ballard about looking at himself in that way, is that, often I think that conversation about should you have brought in this type of free agent, we just reach a sort of philosophical, like, football disagreements with Chris Ballard, where just as a general approach, he does often think that, free agency is a lot of guys who get discarded for reasons, and you don't learn those reasons until you bring them into your building. And so a lot of the reasons why he hasn't gone for that has been to maintain a culture and not upset it, not have guys react poorly to money that you don't know. It's better to give that money to guys you do know, that you feel a little bit better about how they're going to react to it. And Buckner kind of laid it out there to make him look in the mirror and realize, like, some of those things I said I'm trying to avoid in free agency is what I'm getting by re-signing the guys here. Some of these guys here did not, I think, respond the greatest to getting raises, getting promotions. He brought that up too, where he said when you're on your second or third contract, that isn't just time to kick your feet up. That's time to like raise the level of play. And he didn't see that out of the guys he brought back. Also, some of these guys that he does bring back, I think those are the players that you need to scrutinize a little bit better about. Like there should be a reason they go to free agency. It could be he usually banks on guys who've been injured in the past and overlooks that. That's often what drives some players to free agency from other teams. So it's like he's admitted that he didn't scrutinize the scrutiny he takes to free agency, where he just finds problems with a lot of the options out there. He doesn't apply that same scrutiny to his own roster, and admitted the hardest thing to do is to evaluate your own roster, which is why I think it's always very dangerous and tricky when teams ask a GM to rebuild his own roster. It's a disconnect in how you, especially this heavily of a draft and develop type of franchise. It's a disconnect in the way you scout, is that you don't scout college players only looking at what they are. He's such a good scout because he looks at like what they can be, what they're eventually going to be. But if you scrutinize every player's spot under those lens only, what he could be, if you only are looking at the absolute best case scenario, you're looking away from that stuff that could be downside. That's how you get trapped in this spot where not only is the roster not talented enough and has holes, but what he really started to feel, what DeForest Buckner really re-emphasized, is how complacent that kind of roster gets when they're 4 years removed from the playoffs now. And the further we get, a lot of these guys have not won before. They've not gone to the playoffs. None of them have a division title here in Indianapolis. And the longer that they separate themselves from that 2020 playoff appearance or the two games in 2018, it becomes a little bit more clear that you don't have to win to keep a job and get a promotion here. And that's just going to empower people. We always hear that like more money makes someone more of what they are. Well, if they didn't have that burning urgency in the first place because of the standard set, then they're not going to usually add that once they've gotten higher guarantees contracts, higher base values, contracts that make it so they can't really be benched. That's what I think ended up playing out mostly for his defense, which is the side of the ball Buckner's on that he called out the egos on. It's the side of the ball that Kenny Moore's on when he talked about practice and preparation, which could have been about a lot of things, but I think we've heard enough about that on the defense that led the league in missed tackles and some of these things that just feel like within their control a little bit more than. So some of it's talent and roster, but a lot of it was the habits and the just sort of the culture that ended up playing out from this. And so it's one of those, like Chris Ballard build everything on a team building strategy on building culture. And in the course of it realizes that actually has set up some of the culture questions they're facing now.
Yeah. He really boiled the locker room culture issues down to the lack of competition. Let me find the quote that really stuck out to me. I didn't create enough competition on the roster. There's got to be some stress. There has to be real stress within that locker room, an uncomfortability that if I don't play well enough, and I'm going to use the biblical word for donkey, will not be on the field. And that's something that I think a lot of fans have been talking about all season, is that, and it's played out in different ways. Sometimes it's played out in there's not somebody to come in for a player who's struggling. They don't have as many options. I think another way it plays out is Julian Blackmon's shoulder injury. Now, Blackmon probably wanted to play through that, if we're being honest. depending on the length of the surgery, because he's on a 1-year deal and he's trying to prove himself for next year. But for the 2024 Colts, after Julian Blackmon hurt his shoulder, they needed to have somebody that they could put in there so they didn't have to put whatever version of Julian Blackmon that couldn't tackle was out there. You know, that's another place that it comes in, is that was a guy who wasn't playing well enough with his injury to stay on the field, and probably should have, you know, as admirable as it is, try to play through pain and alter your tackling style and stuff like that. He was struggling, and they didn't have anybody that they felt could go in there. You know, that's another spot where, like, backup running back is another place where this comes up. No one had to earn their job. It was set the moment they did it. Like, there's a lot of them this year. There just weren't that many position battles when we got to training camp. And, you know, Ballard used to talk about, when I first got here in 2018, there was a lot of talk about, you know, if you're cutting guys and they're picking up 3 or 4, it says a lot of, and other NFL teams are picking up 3 or 4 at the waiver wire, you know, that says a lot about your roster. This year, it felt like the 53-man roster was like, it was like a 50-man roster, a 49-man roster, and they were going to stick some guys on there. And I know some people got claimed, defensive linemen specifically got claimed, but it wasn't like a bunch of guys getting claimed across the league.
Well, and there also just were guys on this roster at the tail end that we couldn't figure out why they were here. And like, that's problematic, because like those roster spots, that bottom of the roster is where you can really create that competition. I covered the Lions used to take that to the extreme where they signed a new player every week. It was like a survivor game, but it's sort of supposed to mean something. It's supposed to, you know, there's, for example, when you roll back the secondary that he admitted that wasn't good enough, wasn't experienced enough last year. I mean, the number one issue was that was a talent deficit, that they were not going to be maybe special enough, different enough in the AFC to hold up that way. But on a competition level, when we talk about some of these habits, when you just bring back a guy like Dallas Flowers off an Achilles tear, that is not a threat to Juju Brents or Jalen Jones in any way. Like, I mean, you just handed them those jobs. And that's just an example of it. But that happened really across the board here in a lot of different positions. You know, DeForest Buckner pointed this out, but the one of the only competitions they created by any type of move, bringing someone new in, was when they spent a second-round pick on A.D. Mitchell. You got Alec Pierce, who's a former second-round pick, but, you know, it had middling production so far. Like, that lit a fire. And Chris Ballard shared about how Alec went into his office and, you know, asked, like, what does this mean for me? And you could sense at that time Alec was feeling some heat, but Alec has laid out that it all turned positive because he was able to really get intentional with his goals, intentional with his game. You know, and he had a really nice season. And A.D. Mitchell didn't, but you didn't have to hit on both. You needed, I mean, they needed to have more receiving targets. But the important thing was they got one of those receivers to have the type of season that you would have taken out of either one. And there just were a lot of spots, whether it was running back, tight end, outside cornerback, I'd put linebacker in this, safety a little bit. Just too many spots where there could have been more competition. Or I would even say, and this is what I think is still a disconnect with Chris, is it's not with me. I would say the way I look at it is it's not, the habits are definitely one part of that, the egos and all that, but there's also a talent deficit at too many of these positions where a guy who's a starter could have been your backup, and it's just a different conversation. So that's kind of why, looking back, you know, I was as hard on them signing a difference-making safety. It's not that Nick Cross didn't have a chance to be something solid like he ended up playing as. It was that there's just no depth behind that. There's no ability to sit Julian Blackmon down when he is hurt. And there's no true upside to that. And that happened at some other spots where it was like, hey, if Jalen Jones and Samuel Womack work out, which they mostly, I felt like they kind of did, the upside wasn't a Pro Bowl type player, you know, but you could have created that. And then maybe those guys are your second line. So when you have an injury, like you do to Juju Brents. It's just it affected it kind of all over. But I thought one thing he said that I do wonder if he's going to change his tune on it all is when he said that he wanted the players to have this sort of hunger after just missing the playoffs last year and felt like that didn't happen. And he says lack of competition. That's true. But I also think part of the evaluation needs to be that some guys, whether like Kylan Granson or Samuel Womack or Trey Sermon could be the hungriest players on earth. There's a certain limit to like what they're going to be able to bring. And so you're trying to level up your team. You want them to be hungry for that. Like not everything can be solved by hunger and culture. So while I think it's important that he recognized that went awry from his team building, I also think they have to have a bigger conversation about the talent level that they have, especially these premium spots, that like not everything's just going to be solved with, the egos being right, the hunger being right. Like at some point, part of investing more in free agency or trading up in the draft or making a trade for a player is also to boost the talent level, because that's the other thing that is not good enough right now.
I think one of the places that stuck out to me was the defensive line. Like when he was asked about the defensive line, the question was, why do you think the defensive line failed to live up to your expectations? Because he was so bullish on them, like kind of dragging the defense along if they had issues in the secondary. And he really pushed back on that in a way I was surprised by. He kind of said I know they had fewer sacks. Everybody looks at sacks. The follow-up question to that was, well, if that's true that they played well, then what do you have to do? What do you have to fix to get home? And how do you explain something along the lines of how do you explain the run defense getting to be the way it was? And he basically just answered that with tackling. He didn't really get into the defensive reasons for the lack of pressure and sacks. But that was one spot that I was like, we have a different evaluation on the defensive line. I think most people would. That one really surprised me. That really surprised me. What I do think, though, I will say this: I do think that that answer and some subsequent answers to questions sort of tell you what he's thinking about this offseason, where they might add, because we asked him about the secondary, and all he said about the secondary is we've got to be better. And then we said both cornerback and safety, and he said we've got to be better. And then we didn't really ask specifically about the linebacking position as a group, but he did talk a lot about tackling.
Yeah.
And the linebackers missed a lot of tackles, specifically the weak side linebacker, who's a free agent.
Yeah. Those are your two big tackle spots. I think that what is probably different about the way you talk about defensive line than the rest of this is I think he thought that was the one area they did have competition, because, they drafted Leatu Latu and they had brought back Samson Ebukam, who then happened to get hurt. But then you have Dio Dangbo trying to fit in, in the mix of that. They kept 10 defensive linemen.
And that was the one spot they did have claims. And I actually got curious. This is some football nerd nonsense. This is like a Joel Erickson, Mike Chappell special. Eric Johnson did play significantly as a rotational member for the Patriots. Titus Leo did not. So there's your update on the guys that were claimed. Johnson, 17 tackles, no sacks, but it looks like he played in, the majority of the games. So it was at least a rotational piece for them. So there was a claim at that spot. But that to back up your point, that's one of them.
Yeah, so I think like that he approached so many spots of the roster today in that mindset of, did I add enough competition? Did we have that, or did egos bring them down? And I think it probably also helped that DeForest Buckner is his best defensive lineman, and he's kind of leading this charge. So I just think it was probably translate a little too much to that lens. I mean, it's fair to say that the defensive line was not, like he's used at one point, I didn't think they played bad. I don't think they played bad either. The problem is that they're the number one highest paid defensive line in football. That's got to be a difference-making unit. There weren't a lot of units on this team that you could say coming into the year like, okay, this is what's going to separate us. We're just going to be better than 90% of the teams at this. The two areas I thought that they had a lane to do that in were the pass rush and the run game. We saw the greatness at times with the run game, just in and out in terms of how much they stuck with it, how available those guys were, all of that. I don't know that we saw the special level of the pass rush. So there were several games where they weren't bad. I think that's a group that, like, some of those games that they against good offenses, like I know the Lions especially, I thought they really challenged them pretty well given how tough that opponent is. They didn't really take games over, though. And so I know he brought up how, like, teams are throwing quick and max protect, which is an implication that the coverage is bad, which, you know, he's brought that up in the secondary, but we know linebackers can't cover anything either. So there's truth to that. I still think if this was like the 2015 Broncos pass rush, the way that they built this and sometimes talked about it to be, and it was closer to last year, we're not having that same conversation. So I think it's fair to say, like, yeah, of course, like I wouldn't say the defensive line was the problem with the defense, but it was paid to be the solution up against the lack of investments at all those other areas and the lack of experience. And it wasn't. And it is interesting that he looks at it as like it isn't a priority to really look at. Maybe that's because nothing's going to change with it this offseason. Like they'll probably lose Dio Dangba to free agency maybe and roll back the rest of the group. But it is fair to say that, like, the model that they built on defense, where that defensive line was just going to carry everything, that didn't work this season.
Yeah. One of the other things I just thought about with this lack of additions that he kept talking about, you know, we kind of said this all offseason, I think, now that I'm remembering it. We haven't talked about this in a while, but I'm remembering now that we talked about this a ton during the offseason. The thing about running it back was, you know, you made sure you didn't open any new holes. They also didn't add really anybody with the exception of, at the time, they thought Latu would do this, but it didn't really work out that way. They didn't really add anybody who made them better, who could take them to the next level. And, you know, whether or not that's competition, whether or not that's anything, they didn't do anything except keep the holes filled that were – they prevented new holes from forming, essentially. That's all they did last offseason. They didn't add anything to what they had. And then when you do that, it opens you to the spot where, I mean, we'll get into this. This might be the start of our transition into the talk about the quarterback. Quarterback play was rough enough that I don't know that filling all those holes fixes everything. But maybe there's a chance. Maybe there's a chance you get in on the rest of the roster. Maybe. I do think it's instructive. We can use this as a transition to quarterback now that we're there. I do think it's instructive that he brought up, and he actually said this and kind of laughed at himself. Almost like this was at the end of the presser. It was almost like he realized it at the time. But like the two times they made the playoffs in his tenure, the quarterbacks were Andrew Luck and Phillip Rivers. And he said the quarterback thing has been an albatross. He's right. Like there's an element to this that with all the other stuff that you're doing, what really matters for next season is what's going to happen at quarterback, which I think this is a good transition for us. Like we got a little bit of information on what he thinks about the quarterback and everything going forward.
Yeah, that was going to be the biggest topic to get into is that because like you said, that guy's the direction of the entire franchise. The guy's what they're going to be next year. And also we really needed someone to set some things straight. It's been just a weird year of messaging and talking about that position from Shane to Anthony to just the plans they laid out and what they did. So I thought it was interesting that I thought he gave the best explanation by far of why the benching had to happen. And he said his quote was he was drowning, talking about Anthony at that time. And it was talking about both on the field, mentally, the poise he was playing with as a passer, as well as some of the behind the scenes stuff we've heard about with his preparation, and that he just needed a pause, which when we broke this down at midseason, we talked about how that's a risky approach based on the history of the NFL, because rarely do you actually get to pause and then get the toothpaste back in the tube and roll it back out and then it succeeds. But I do think there was a logic based on the way that he laid out why they got to that point. We just hadn't really heard it explained that way because of just everything with how it was originally rolled out there. So I thought on some levels, like, you could see Chris, he owned the fact that, like, they just didn't set up a good plan from the get-go, of where they got excited about this uber athletic player and they gave him a starting role really quickly when he was the youngest starting quarterback for 2 straight years in the NFL, and the injury just kind of elongated some of that. So I think on some level you're encouraged that they recognize that they didn't do this the right way, or at least you're encouraged that they found that they could look in the mirror that way. I think the part that's concerning a little bit to me was when he compared Anthony Richardson to a kid who didn't clean his room. Partly because I think some of that, because a lot of the questions are about, like, why didn't they realize this earlier? Why didn't they emphasize these things with him earlier? And I think that actually was a window into it, where it's like, I think a lot of the things he did that are very lighthearted, I think they often shrugged off as, well, he's just young, he'll learn it, without a real intentional approach to making sure he learns it. I think some of that was giving him the job that early and making him a captain. I think looking back, some of it was, I wish he had a better quarterback to learn behind, frankly, a guy who's been a face of the franchise and not Gardner Minshew was a fit for the coaching staff. He filled in reasonably well when he needed to, but that was not a guy who's been the face of a franchise, drafted high. He's not really built. I don't think he's the guy to teach seriousness and the personality. And it's probably never what he should have been there for. Looking back, I think that position, I probably should have scrutinized that decision more at the time, because it was a good fit for the coaching staff, but it was also like they really needed a teacher for Anthony in a lot of different ways. I think back to the year before when they had Matt Ryan, we talked at the time about how, like, that was going to be, it had to be a short-term plan because he was like 37. But the dream was that he could give you 1 to 2 years and you draft a guy who learns behind him. They lost that. And then because of the way that they kind of mismanaged quarterbacks with the owner meddling in 2022, I think they lost the ability to sign many veterans in the interim. It's telling to me that the 2 they've signed since have been very specific fits with the coaching staff, guys that Shane Steichen's coached before, but didn't necessarily set it up to be the guys that you need to learn behind. The way that maybe like a Jacoby Brissett, as an example, could have been a better one. And that's not even the best example, because I think you, more than the person in the leadership and the willingness, you need someone who's walked that walk before. So just looking back, I think that was telling. And we're still at that same point that we were wondering, like, can you get that? Can you just reverse engineer this and teach it in this way after the way this has gone? And I don't know. It does feel like a big unknown with Chris, though, and he seemed to acknowledge that when he talked about bringing in competition for next year.
I had a thought. I'm going to throw this out there. I'm curious what your reaction to it is. When he brought up the kid thing, because he's not the only one to say that. You know, players have emphasized his youth. We've emphasized his youth. I think you can include us, you and me, but also the royal media in there too. Like where we have referred to him as, if not a kid, like a super young player, and sort of given him more leeway because of that. I'm not convinced that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Because he's playing the role he's playing is a franchise-defining, like, it's a franchise-defining role, regardless of when you take over, at what age you are. And I'm not saying that, like, you should necessarily be like, if you don't come in and you know how to do everything exactly like Peyton Manning or Phillip Rivers or honestly Matt Ryan, because you bringing up Matt Ryan like Matt Ryan's body was gone, but like everything I heard about Matt Ryan as a preparer was that he was a Peyton disciple, basically. So like maybe you don't expect that from him, but also maybe thinking of him not necessarily as a kid or a young guy and thinking of him as a pro instead crystallizes some of these things. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say there? That like there's going to be some issues. There's going to be some issues, but like, you know, there's going to be some issues, but and we'll give him a longer leash than we would an older quarterback, but we still have to treat him like an older quarterback. Hope I'm making sense.
No, I totally agree with that. Actually, I feel like that's, and we all struggle with that. I think we talk about him and evaluate him because a lot of times I have tried, we bring up the age and the experience level all the time. And I think that's fair in terms of dialing back maybe big picture takes on what he's going to be, or, especially with the play itself. I think you can explain the play itself if it's just a matter of lack of experience, pressing too much, the things that the young kids are going to do, even when you emphasize that it's a job, just because it's hard. There's a difference between things happening naturally and organically because they're hard, and them happening because you've almost sort of shrugged that off as, he's a kid, so deal with it. Like like there has to be a right and wrong where you allow for failure and to understand like, okay, this was wrong. He's going to do some things that are wrong, but it's got to be emphasized that it's wrong. And I think that was sort of the misstep that we all had, and clearly they had within the building as far as kind of the way he went about just his approach to it. The thing with Anthony is that like he does love this game, and I think he's always wants to do right with it. I think his challenge has always been that he's never looked at football as a job, truly, because like the way he discovered that game was, we all discovered it. All of us who played and loved football discovered it usually in a form of joy. His, I think, was even more. He didn't have, he was hopping a fence behind his Section 8 housing, and that was the only thing he and his brother had to do. And then it became his ticket to, answer all these shortcomings in their life based on how he grew up. And all of a sudden it's like everything was joy for him. And there's been a lot of emphasis in his life about like, never lose that, never change yourself. And so on some level, like football is joy to him, and that has what has brought out the best of him on game day. But he never learned how to package that into being a pro. And I do think if all of us, especially the people in the building who are more responsible for handling it or are responsible, if they had talked about it as like, this is a job and you're working to be a pro, and that means you're going to mess up along the way, but we're going to point out like this is messed up. There's got to be that understanding of like what was right versus what was wrong. I think they missed that with him. And just a very tiny example of what I'm talking about is in that Texans game right before he got benched, he had a run where he was down or he got tackled and he just stayed on the ground and pretended to be hurt. And then he hops back up. And this is something he's always done. It's just been a little bit of the like light sense of humor. I'm not going to try not to take the game too seriously. That is not the way to approach the job in this league, not given his injury history, not given what this franchise has been through with quarterback injury history. Somebody needed to step in the first time he did that and say, okay, this isn't the time for some of the silliness and some of the lightheartedness because of the optics and imaging that you need to rise to it because this is a job. That's the stuff that I thought was kind of always missed, and that Chris today I thought really pointed out in a way that was instructive. But again, the questions are still going to be there just because it's like, where do you go from here? Is the message sinking in? Is it enough? Can he change his ways after he lived as a starting quarterback for a year and a half with this way? And that's why there's still as many questions with Anthony going forward as probably, more questions than there are answers, and as many questions at this point 2 years in than as when he was drafted.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was instructive with in terms of the Anthony Richardson piece, like the first thing, in fact, he said the number one thing with Anthony Richardson above. If you're watching on YouTube and you saw me rush off the camera for a little bit, and now you see Watley, my 2-year-old, my youngest, on the camera. We had a pizza situation. Pizza had to come out of the oven. So some dad work going on during this podcast. And then Watley was screaming outside my door. So it's better for him to be on the camera looking at you guys than screaming outside the door. Anyway,
versatility.
He may make some noises. There it is. There's a Watley noise. Anyway, he said the number one thing is injury availability and just acknowledging he's missed too many games. And then the number two thing was consistency. But the fact that he mentioned injury, that is a little bit different from what he said in the past. I know from background information that the Colts have made decisions on players based on their availability in the past. Usually when asked about those in press conference situations like this, Ballard kind of downplays it and says stuff like, he can't help it. We're hoping he gets back healthy. This was different. This was an acknowledgement that the availability is an issue that could lead to them making moves. In fact, he said later, we got to add competition. And the reason he gave for it was he hasn't been able to stay on the field.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And it makes sense because I think part of obviously the availability questions that factors into your long-term belief in what Anthony is going to be. It obviously factors into his development, getting the reps and consistency. But what it also does is it pulls them back into what they've been trying to get out of, which is the quarterback carousel and not having consistency at that position. And the last season they played before this was when they just kept rotating quarterbacks. That was due to poor play and an owner stepping in and all this kind of stuff. But this one, it's the same end-up effect when you have, Anthony started, what was it? He started 4 games, and then Joe Flacco starts 2 games, and then he comes back, and then he's out for 2 games because of the benching, which that was they chose to do that to reset him. But then at the end of the year, he's out 2 more games. It doesn't build, like every conversation you have with these receivers and about this offense in general is just sort of the lack of, they don't have an identity. They don't have like a chemistry built up. It'd be one thing if like he played 17 games and it was just, we've got all these football things to solve here, but it's like they can't really they can't build momentum with him or some of their passing game and especially the run game when it's just so in and out here. And so they are going to put a bigger emphasis on their backup quarterback because he'll be out. But also, and you brought this point up, and I think it would make sense to go after a mobile quarterback so that they aren't changing the design of things to where they can still be the same type of running team, whether Anthony's out there. He's such an electric runner, maybe a little less, but you get a guy like Justin Fields, he's run for 1,000 yards in this league. Like you can be the same sort of, zone read, wide zone type run team rather than you're constantly trying to install a new playbook catered to different quarterback who's different stylistically, the way Joe Flacco was for Anthony Richardson. So they need a better backup anyway, but it does show you that that's some of the doubt that they've introduced. And it maybe doesn't make you feel better because what you want you want this all to work, of course. I do think Chris Ballard had a good acknowledgement today that like, there is doubt here. You don't bench a quarterback if there wasn't some doubt. And part of that doubt is that durability, which I think he didn't necessarily say this, but I think is factored into that's some of the trust issues that I think Shane has in building the offense out for Anthony is you could emphasize more quarterback run and more zone read and all that, but is he going to be able to take those hits and stay on the field? So then you dial that back and then you have him playing, at his worst as a drop back passer. That's what's become the injury. It's injury and accuracy together, but it's very much tied because he's got to be on the field to build the reps, to get in the offseason, to be healthy. All that's there. Probably the one piece of encouragement that he laid out that I think is very real is at least now that Anthony, once he gets over, it sounds like his back, he said was close to 100% at the very last time we talked to him. Once they get through that, he can have that healthy offseason building the mechanics, which he didn't get last year. You just have to hope that those mechanics carry through. They takes a big jump in accuracy, and that at some point he's going to have to find a way to stay on the field better. And it's obviously still a question, and they acknowledge that today.
Yeah. The one other question about Richardson that was really interesting to me, because it actually kind of gets at the Colts maybe taking. Yep, Watley, you think so too? The Colts getting at sort of the same thing I was just saying about maybe like you can't treat him as a kid anymore. Because Chris Ballard was asked like what can they do to ensure he's doing the right things in the offseason? And he rightly pointed out that they're not supposed to contact him for a certain amount of time because of NFL rules. Like they're not supposed to be like checking up on what he's doing and that kind of thing. But I thought the more interesting part of it, because that's the obvious thing, that's what they say about all these things. I thought the more interesting part of that answer was he essentially said he better know what to do. Like he better do it this offseason. Like it's been 2 years. He should know. We went through everything this year. He should know he's got to prepare. And honestly, if there's no way Anthony Richardson hasn't seen by now, like we're taping this at 6:10 p.m. Chris Ballard said it about 9:20. There's no way Anthony Richardson doesn't know by now that Chris Ballard said, we're going to bring in competition. Richardson has agents. Those agents have people who monitor what the team says. He knows. So if he doesn't respond this offseason in the way he works, well, that's going to be part of the answer. And that's one of the reasons that, just in case that doesn't happen, you got to have, I think he kind of downplayed a question that I asked about, do you need a younger guy? I think you didn't ask any questions, Watley, and now you're talking a ton. But he kind of downplayed a question that was like, does it need to be younger than Joe Flacco? Because obviously there's not a future there. Like, I think this guy, who you bring in, has to be somebody who could be a starter. Not Gardner Minshew, who's a backup. Not Joe Flacco, who's a backup and also about to be 40 years old. It's got to be somebody who could be a starter. Now, does that mean that they could be a franchise quarterback? You're not going to find that person in this situation. But someone who could start for an NFL team like Justin Fields.
It all comes back to Justin Fields. And who knows? I mean, that's just one type. That may not be the guy they go after. But as an example, Justin Fields, what do you know about him? Well, he's a mobile quarterback, so you can keep that part of the offense. He also, for his strengths and weaknesses, whatever you think about him as a quarterback, that everything you hear about him is he's like first in the building, last to leave, lives and breathes football, very serious, very hardwired competitor. These are things Chris Ballard loved about him coming out of the draft. So it's someone like that sort of needs to raise just the everyday temperature of what's going on. So we talked about bringing in competition. This is just one of many areas on the roster that he says he needs to do this with. What's interesting is this is the one spot that he made that promise to actually do it. I think that's very intentional to let Anthony Richardson know that. And I'd said this, I think, on our last pod, where like if they wanted to run back this trio, the pillars of Chris Ballard, Shane Steichen, and Anthony Richardson, you could have gone either way. But if you're going to do it, it's because they're in lockstep and you want to see it through. But what had to happen this offseason for this to have a chance is all three of those guys need to feel pressure and have to, from day one until the point where they change some part of what they're doing, some part of the process that created the problems that they're in. So Chris Ballard acknowledged that he's at that spot when he has captains calling out his culture and recognizing that running it back and not adding fresh blood has created these problems. He's talking as if he's a guy that like it can't be business as usual. They're hoping that's going to happen with Anthony Richardson. Now that he's a healthy offseason, he knows there's competition coming in. Then you heard Shane Steichen talk a little bit about that. And it was the last time we talked about being relentless. Like he made a promise to be relentless this offseason to get this on track. I'd be interested to hear from him. I guess it'll be the combine because he said he'd get back to us in terms of evaluating a lot of how his year went down, from messaging to play design to how he handled the quarterback. He's another guy that like is going to have to really get the fire turned up on him to fix some of his issues from this season as a leader and a messenger and just some of the play design stuff. If they all do that and they can get back to their strengths without being pulled down by their weaknesses and oblivious to their weaknesses, this still does have a chance between the upside of Shane as a play caller that he's shown, Anthony Richardson's outrageous talent, and Chris's ability to scout draft, develop, and build at least a floor of a roster that they're supposed to add the upside to. It's got to all happen right now, because if it just repeats in some of the same strengths and weaknesses they have already, we just saw how that's going to play out. And ultimately, if you don't have a passing game, you don't have an offensive identity, and you don't have a talented and competitive roster, you end up being 8-9 with a lot of close wins over bad teams and one win over a good team. And that's where, like, Chris acknowledging we're not close shows you, like, all three of them have to make those jumps, and they need to feel that pressure from right now through the end of the season.
If you're watching on YouTube, I don't think many of you do watch on YouTube. Most of you listen. This is easily Watley's longest. This isn't a cameo. Like, he's a full part of the back half of this podcast. So, like, right now, he's currently picking up a baseball and throwing it down. He's underneath the desk right now trying to get it. He's coming back. Here we go. He's back. He's already working on his throwing. He didn't have a back injury. He had to heal up.
He's like, we're going to take this from cover 2 to cover 3 right now.
Oh, you want me to stop talking, or you want me to talk? I can't tell. Anyway, the Shane Steichen piece was interesting just because, from a messaging standpoint, Chris Ballard said point blank, like, Steichen has to be better at that.
Yeah. The messaging part was interesting because, Chris Ballard, they have a setup to where Shane is the sole voice of the team in season. And it's an interesting display where it's like, or dynamic where, like, Chris is so good at conversations, communication, messaging. Like, this is his element, these press conferences, which that's what drives some people crazy, is he's like, that's a less important part than the action, but he is really good at it. Shane is more like, his strengths are in the action and the play design and in the, some of the development, but he's the one that's asked to talk all the time, 4 days a week. And that's not a strength of his, and not, I don't think, been a priority of his to this point. So that was good acknowledgement too, that's because I think, like, it's one thing when the results haven't been there, as they haven't for the past 4 years, and for Shane, two 500 record but no playoff appearances. But I think where fans feel the disconnect is when they feel like they've been speaking a different language in the franchise, and that's happened a lot this season. I thought Chris reset a lot of that today, but then we'll be curious to see, like, how that plays out going forward, because Chris is great at press conferences. He'll have one at the combine. He'll have one at the draft. He'll have one to start training camp, to end training camp. And then the way it's been going is take the full season off. Goes back to Shane talking every day. Shane says he's reviewing all this and he's going to try and learn and grow from this part. And Chris has told him he's got to be better at it. How much better can he get at it? Will it become a priority when we're into weekly game planning? It's not the most important part. The most important part is the football and the relationship. But part of the relationship with Anthony is getting the messaging about Anthony to be in a better spot. So I thought that was good acknowledgement that it's going to take more than just, calling better plays or Anthony just throwing better passes. Like, there has to be a better relationship for them going forward. There has to be better overall messaging from Shane with this team to get to work through some of these either cultural issues or just gaps that they have to get them. Like, both of their goals have to be get to the playoffs and get Anthony Richardson playing well. Both in some ways are tied to the messaging. And so that's one of many areas they have to get better at.
Yeah. The element of the hard part about this stuff here at the end of the season is that there's a lot of it it's just, we asked Chris Ballard, somebody asked Chris Ballard something along the lines of, a lot of people are saying this is all stuff you've said before. And he acknowledged the truth. Like, this is all talk right now from all of them. And now we go into a period of the offseason where there is some stuff we're going to learn. Like, next week, they're doing defensive coordinator interviews. We already know Lou Anarumo is part of it. We know that Steve Wilkes is a part of it. We know that there's other guys involved. We don't know exactly who all they are yet. But they're doing that next week. We're going to learn some stuff on the defense going forward. But this is going to be they're going into their evaluation period. And sometimes what they say now in the heat of the end of the season doesn't work out that way. Like, for instance, last year, Chris Ballard said, I didn't give Gus Bradley enough in the secondary, and then he gave him the exact same secondary after sleeping on it for 2 months. I don't think that's going to happen this time, but maybe it could. So that's the hard part, is the proof is going to be in the pudding, and we're going to learn about it in stages, because I think we'll learn about what Ballard's done in March when we get to free agency, and we see if they've changed up anything at all. And then we'll start to learn a little bit about Steichen, because he starts talking in April. And maybe there's some more reflection stuff. And then we're really not going to learn anything about Anthony Richardson until training camp starts. There'll be a lot of words said, but I don't know that we'll learn anything about Anthony Richardson, barring an early injury, until training camp starts. And that's the thing about the offseason. You start from this point that they've laid out, and we see where they go. If you're a Colts fan, if you're a Colts fan, you either hope that they turn it all around, or if you're just ready to blow it all up, you hope it blows up in their faces.
Yeah, I think this year's going to be a good test of that, because you're asking 3 people to change, and one of the hardest things for humans to do is change. So we're going to kind of see if it's words, if it's just sort of, if it's a thought that isn't a priority, or if it's a day-to-day wiring that these 3 guys take. If it is, it will show up. It will show up, because I think we will see the stuff. Some of the stuff is in their control, as far as Chris Ballard. If he wants free agents here, he will sign them. If Shane wants to message more honestly, he'll do that. And if Anthony wants to attack this offseason in a preparation level, now that he's healthy, in a way that he never has before, I do think some of that will show up. Don't know if it'll all be enough, but it is like, that is the big question. The real tests are going to come later. That's why I was trying to see if Chris Ballard would make a promise about signing free agents, just because it was less to me about making a promise to us so we can hold you to it, which is the way that he kind of took that, rightly interpreted it, or fairly interpreted it. To me, it's almost more like, do you make a promise to yourself? Like, I will do this, and I will hold myself to it. It's on my to-do list. It's a goal. It's my 2025 resolution, is to sign free agent starters. Because I think it's one thing to look at, like, to be in the heat of evaluation at the end of a long season, and you're feeling the failure of this year's team, to when you spin it forward and he's knee deep in draft prep and liking so many of the guys in the draft this year, and then he sees the prices in free agency. Are you willing to still say, hey, this is a priority, even if it's not normally what I've done? It's not, I may not like some of these prices. I know I'm overpaying on some levels, which is sometimes part of free agency, and answering and solving needs that way. Could be signing guys that don't end up playing because they're just here for competition. Is he willing to do that in March? I think it's a major test, because his track record is so entrenched that, like, he's going to have to create more action. That's really the case for all these guys. All of them are going to have to really prove this, because what they've shown us so far is that, they've kind of consistently been this one thing, and they're trying to evolve to be something else. So action's going to be the only way.
That's what we've got for the Colts Cover-2 podcast for today. I don't know what our cadence will be. We'll figure something out. We probably should talk defensive coordinator candidates next week. That's probably where we'll end up next week. For now, we're going to let this stuff breathe a little bit. There's a ton of stuff on the website. I think it was 8 stories between the 2 of us, off the plus the one that Greg Doyle did. So there's a ton of stuff on the website to read from this week. We'll see where the Colts go with this, beginning with the defensive coordinator hire. That's the first thing that can kind of happen. For the Colts Cover-2 podcast, I'm Joel A. Erickson. This is Nate Atkins. We are in the offseason, people. We will find out how different, or if anything is different.